Welcome, Guinness theologians. This is Around the Word in many classes. Today is our second installment in our Guinness Apologetics series. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink, and let's get into it. Now, as a general rule on this channel, the drink you pour yourself can be whatever you would like, whatever is at hand, whatever you would particularly like to enjoy. But let's remember that there is an exception to this rule in the Guinness Apologetics series, and that is for the church member who, again, we are calling Keith. You must be drinking a Guinness. That is the rule. You're not allowed to watch these without drinking a Guinness. I know that you mentioned it to me. You got a Guinness last time. Again, doesn't have to be the fancy can with the little ball in the bottom of it, but it has to be a Guinness of one variety or another. But for the rest of you, feel free to pour anything you would like. And as what I think will be a tradition on this channel, or at least for this series, at least whenever I have the nitrogen can, let's listen. It is the best sounding can opening that there is, right? There's something refreshing sounding about, just about any can of beer, but there's something special about the Guinness, or I guess technically any nitro beer. Should I leave this? Right, and should I leave it, harp out, or I guess it's harp with the name. I don't know, I'm going to use the same thumbnail I did in the last one. I don't remember which direction the can is facing, but for today, I'm feeling just the harp. That looks good. And as we wait for the Guinness to settle so that we can crack into it and really get into our lesson for today, as a reminder, this series has come about, and the reason it's coming out when it comes out is because I'm teaching this to my confirmation class. And I think that'll come out a little bit in today's class. Probably going to do a little bit more with you guys here than I will with the kids. Probably not much, because for today's lesson, you're either dipping your toe in the pool or you're diving headfirst and going all the way to the bottom of the deep end. I don't know how you can do anything in the middle. And so we're going to do the toe dipping thing, because quite frankly, you need a primer in philosophy and a lot of other stuff if you really want to dive into today's topic. Before I tell you what that is, cheers. Excellent. Keith, I hope you're enjoying your Guinness as well. And so, empowered by our stout, let's get into it. So today, in the second lesson in the series, we're going to be looking at the question and kind of doing an apologetic, a defense of the question, does God exist? Which seems a little bit strange. You might think that this is a good place to start with apologetics, but rather we started with Jesus. We're going to get into why we do the apologetic of Jesus before we get to the general apologetic toward or for deity, for God. We'll note that we have established in this course, mostly because we don't have anyone arguing against us, so it's really easy to establish things in a debate when there's only one person talking. But we've established in this class that Jesus is God, right? That's what we covered in the last Guinness Apologetics. Right, we addressed that, yes, it is reasonable and rational to believe that Jesus existed. Just about everyone does believe that. We concluded that, no, Jesus isn't just a moral teacher. He is who he says he is, or he's crazy. And I suppose you can go off that direction. But because I don't have anyone arguing with me, we've established that Jesus is who he says he is. And he says that he's God. And then last but not least, which will again be important, we've established that Jesus rose from the dead, that the resurrection did in fact happen, and that we can reliably and reasonably believe that. It's not irrational to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. So keep all that in the back of your mind, because it will be coming back up for today's lesson, because it's, quite frankly, going to be critically important that we start not with God in general, but with Jesus in particular. But we'll get there. So what I want to do first is go over the what are known in theological circles as the natural arguments for God. And I should have counted. I'm going to count on my notes here just to get the number. We're going to go over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the natural philosophical arguments for God. They all have their own fancy names. We're going to go over what the name is, what the actual argument is, and we'll talk a little bit about the argument. This is where it's either a toe dip or a dive. You can spend a lot of time on this, or you can just kind of become acquainted with this. We're going to do the former, or the latter, rather, because I'm going to be teaching this to confirmation students. And we don't have time to do the deep, deep dive. And quite frankly, they need more school before middle schoolers are just simply not ready to do the rigorous philosophical work you would need to really nail all of this. And after that, we're going to talk a little bit about another philosophical, not an argument for God, but a rational proof, if you will. We'll get to that when we get there. And then we'll conclude with Christ. We always finish with Christ, right? So the first of these philosophical arguments that we're going to cover is known as the ontological argument. I'm not going to bother giving you the literal definitions of a lot of these words, because quite frankly, I don't know what they are. Probably would help to remember which one's which, but you don't really need to know the name as long as you kind of know the philosophy, the argument behind it. And the ontological argument is that there must be a being that is superior to all other beings, right? This makes rational sense, right? So when we think on very naturalistic and easy to see level, you would say that humans are superior to ants, right? We have the capacity for reason, the whole 9 yards. Well, by extension, we can assume as humans that there must be a being superior to us. It just seems reasonable and logical. I mean, look at the world, right? Let's at least hope that there's a being superior to humanity out there. And who knows? There could be hundreds of different beings out there somewhere that are greater than us, that are superior in every way to humanity. Well, the ontological argument is, again, a thought experiment that says the being that is greater than every other being is what we call God. That being is God. And so the pinnacle of all creatures, well, not creatures, creatures is the wrong word. The pinnacle of all beings is God. Kind of to boil this down into simple terms, this argument, the ontological argument, states that there must be a God because we can conceive of a God. Using rational reason, we can picture, imagine, rationalize the pinnacle of beings, or God. This argument has weaknesses to it. Quite frankly, all of these arguments have a lot of flaws. And we're not going to go over all their flaws because we'll be here all day. But just know that from the time that these arguments were proposed up until now, there have been flaws with them. And philosophers on either side have been working through just about all of these. Certainly a lot of the ones with the funnier names or the fancier names. Philosophers have been thinking through adjusting them. It's been an ongoing debate for a couple hundred years. This argument really comes to the fore during the Enlightenment period. I think if I remember rightly, the first person to propose the ontological argument was Anselm of Canterbury. I first experienced or encountered the ontological argument in reading Rene Descartes. He's the I think, therefore I am guy. And in that same book, which has a ridiculously long name, let's see if I can remember it. It's the method. Everyone just calls it the Discourse on the Method because it starts off with the discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and seeking truth in the sciences. I still remember, it's been years since I read it, but you gotta love these high enlightenment titles to work because they're so long. But in that's where Rene Descartes does the "I think, therefore I am," and he extends that the line of logic and reasoning that comes from, and he extends it into the ontological argument, saying, "I think, therefore I am," yada yada yada. I can conceive of a perfect being, therefore he must exist. It has its flaws. We'll leave it there, but don't dismiss it out of hand because Rene Descartes in this book is what started the scientific revolution. Right? I think, therefore I am is kind of the beginning of enlightenment, the beginning of science in a modern standpoint. So don't discredit Descartes just because right, his cogito ergo sum is a little bit of a joke because most people don't understand what he's talking about. But that's neither here nor there. That's the ontological argument. The second is the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument. And what this argument does is it looks to the cosmos, right? Cosmological. Looks to the universe and says that the universe itself is proof of God. And this is essentially why something rather than nothing, which is another one of those great philosophical questions. And the cosmological argument says, why something? Because God. The mere fact that existence is points to or directs towards God. Again, problems with this argument, but it does help us answer questions that science hasn't been able to answer, that these great mysterious questions of the universe that so many people get so excited about. Right? So like, what was there before the Big Bang, right? Nothing. Even science will say there was a singularity, right? Which isn't really anything, but it's also everything. What the cosmological argument says is God. God is the producer, if you will. I'm avoiding saying certain things because it falls under a different category. We'll get to that one next. But essentially, the cosmological argument is the answer to the question, why something rather than nothing? Which, if you've never asked yourself that question, then that's all good. If you have asked yourself that question, you might just be a budding philosopher, and you come into the philosophical pool. It's a great place to be. It's lots and lots of fun. But you do have to read a lot of really thick books. The books aren't actually that big. The words are gigantic, and no one ever explains anything that they're talking about. They all just assume you've read every philosophical book they've read, and you understand them, and they just go from there. So philosophy can be a little tricky, but it's so much fun once you get into it. The next argument, which does really dovetail nicely with the cosmological argument, is the teleological argument. Which, well, I said I wasn't going to define the words. It comes from the Greek telos, which means order. Roughly. That's a rough translation. I don't know. Anyway, you guys know what I'm talking about. The teleological argument states that because the universe that we do inhabit, because the universe does exist, obviously, because this universe displays order, that implies someone who gave it order. And I think this is actually a stronger argument than most people give it credit for. I think of the arguments that we're going to go over, this one might be the strongest, at least in my view. You've probably heard this argument before, especially if you've done apologetics on creation. This one comes up a lot. And the way it's usually phrased is with an analogy. So imagine you're walking through the forest, and something shiny catches your eye. So you look down, and you see a pocket watch. You've never seen a pocket watch before. You pick this thing up, and you wonder, what is this? Where did it come from? Is it naturally occurring, or did someone create it? And so you examine it. You take a look at it. and you see all the gears, and you don't know what it's for necessarily, but you see that there's a clear purpose and an order to this pocket watch. It seems, just by examination, to be an intricate piece of machinery that has a function, and that it functions in a precise and orderly way. Now, upon looking at it, you can say, this is the most amazing naturally occurring thing in the world. It's possible, right? It is possible that that pocket watch just appeared there, or is some sort of a conglomeration of natural forces. It's possible. However, it's more reasonable to assume someone made this thing. Right? You don't necessarily know what it's for. You don't necessarily know who made it, but the purpose and the order really imply a creator. I think any one of us who was walking through the forest and saw a pocket watch would assume someone made it, that it was created. How much more intricate is the universe that we live in, that it really does imply a creator. And the reason why I think this is a great analogy, it's a good place to start, but the reason why I think this has a lot of force to it is that the universe, and granted, I'm not an astrophysicist or a physicist in any regard. I don't even think I rise to the level of amateur in any of that. But, and I think, again, I'm an amateur, so correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's the second law of thermodynamics. But it's the law of entropy. I know that it's called the law of entropy. And this essentially is it's a scientific law that states that objects in order over time will move towards disorder, right? So it's kind of like if you're playing pool, and you start out and you have the cue ball on one end and you have all the other balls arranged in your nice triangle or diamond or whatever it is that you're playing, and then you begin the game. You start out with a very orderly pool table, and then chaos kind of erupts. And that's kind of how our universe works. Things go from ordered to chaotic. And at least observably, it doesn't go the other way. Now, things can intervene and cause order, but there needs to be generally human intervention. Right? Humans need to become involved, or some sort of an outside force, right? You can say like ants creating an ant colony or something, right? But typically we talk about, humans will create things to, or do things, influence their surroundings in order to create order out of chaos. But that's an outside force, right? And so that, again, lends this credence to the teleological argument. Because if we're sticking with the model of the Big Bang, which I'm just going to leave this here, and we'll talk about it when we hit the creation apologetic. I'm perfectly fine with Big Bang theory. I have absolutely zero qualms with it. I think it aligns precisely with Scripture. And that picture, I don't know if you've ever seen this. It's a picture of like the white noise created at the Big Bang. I think it's a picture of creation. I think it's really cool. That we have a picture of the beginning of the universe, when God created the universe. I know not everyone believes that, but let's just stick with the model that most scientists tend to work with, right? The Big Bang, then you have this very orderly, again, I'm an amateur when it comes to this. I'm built beneath an amateur. My understanding is you kind of have this giant milkshake of generally homogeneous atoms. That is the universe, and it's rapidly expanding and all of that. And that's all good, right? The explosive concussive force of the Big Bang hasn't been overtaken by gravity yet, right? So, we haven't descended back into, another little singularity after the heat death of the universe and all that kind of nonsense. I shouldn't say nonsense, craziness. And then, so we have a homogeneous, very orderly form. And then, right, chaos erupts, right? Gravitational forces, all that kind of stuff. But what follows this is more and more order coming out of the chaos, right? I mean, there shouldn't have been, and again, I'm an amateur, there should not have been solar systems forming, right? We would expect the opposite to happen. We would expect, for instance, if we start with a solar system, for the solar system to break apart, or for more chaos to enter into the picture over those billions and trillions of years, rather than more and more order. And this works on a vast cosmological scale, it works on a earthly scale, right? If you don't have the components for life, it's very unlikely that they would come together independently, right? That just, entropy doesn't expect that to happen. And even if it did, for more and more order to be occurring, entropy doesn't like that. Again, this is my understanding, but all of this lends credence, from what I understand of scientific observation and thermodynamics and all of that, it lends incredible credence to this teleological argument that, well, the reason there's order, the reason that things did line up the way they needed to, was not sheer chance over time, which, you make your numbers big enough, it'll happen. I'm not arguing that, that's fine. But we expect a creator. It's not irrational to believe in some sort of a creative or guiding force, which we would call the deity, God. So I think that the teleological argument has a lot of weight, although it has its counterpoints as well. Don't get me wrong. All of these have people who are able to very reasonably argue against them. The next is the moral argument. I also do think that the moral argument has a pretty significant amount of weight. I think these two are the strongest of the arguments. The moral argument is fairly simple. It's very easy to wrap your mind around. Morality exists, and sociologists have done studies in this. Like, is there a universal ethic? And at least when I took sociology, I was told that there were two sociological taboos that were universal on Earth, with exceptions, right? Because you gotta love that, universal with exceptions. One was incest. There's an incest taboo, although societal forces can overcome that in certain circumstances, such as pharaohs and monarchs, but that's a power struggle sort of thing going on. And the other is a murder taboo, which seems strange, but we also, right, because lots of people murder lots of people all the time, but the sociologists do identify that a lot of people throughout history, a lot of people groups rather, recognize that only they are humans, right? So like, for instance, the Greeks, everyone who wasn't a Greek was a barbarian, which made them less than human, right? Every group of humans throughout history just about has done this to one extent or another. And so it's okay to kill other people that aren't in your tribe, right? Aren't in your group, because, well, they're not really human, right? But you can't kill the people in your tribe, right? Right? The Athenians couldn't kill other Athenians. And you can kill Spartans, because Spartans are just barely better than barbarians. And they thought that of each other. Greeks are fun. But you don't kill your in-group, right? You don't kill your people. I think there's also been work done about whether or not theft is a universal moral taboo. But the point is, there is a universal morality to one extent or another. And societal forces, the effects of sin, can change the degrees to which that influences people's behavior. But there is a general and universal sense of right and wrong on Earth to one extent or another, depending on how broadly you cast your net and how many exceptions you're willing to make, and how much you're willing to account for just the fact that people are sinful and don't like the fact that they have a moral compass. And the moral argument says that the reason there's a universal morality is because God exists, and God has encoded that universal morality within the world. That morality comes from outside of man. It's external to humanity, which is why it influences all of us. It's not something we have produced. And so that rationally, you can then assume that there is some sort of an outside influence. That influence we would call God. The next is, I think, the weakest argument, but maybe that's because I come from a philosophical German tradition, and that's the experiential argument. And I think it's the weakest, so we're going to spend the least amount of time on it. You kind of all, this is kind of the hippie argument, if you will. Not to denigrate it, but this is the idea that people have experiences of God. This is including, but not really focusing on kind of near-death experiences that some people have, or like when people do a whole lot of hallucinogenic drugs and think they see God. I mean, that's, I guess, technically there, but not what this argument is saying. This argument is saying that, you know, when you, again, the example that comes to my mind, right? When you go walk out into Glacier National Park. I heard someone use this argument when I visited Glacier National Park up in Montana. It was fairly moving when you're there, right? When you go walk out into Glacier National Park, you look at the mountains and you look at nature, you just feel like there's a God, right? You just get this overwhelming sense that God must be real. Or when you look at the intricacies of a leaf or any of this. I mean, that's a little bit of teleological, but you just get this feeling deep within yourself that there's a God. Works for some people. I think it's pretty weak for a whole host of reasons, but it is an argument that people have used for the existence of God. The last that we're going to cover, again, fairly briefly, because I don't know how I feel about this one way or the other. This is the historical argument. And the way this argument works is essentially that when you look at the broad strokes of history, I mean broad strokes here, it seems as if the history of the world is moving towards good. That it, or at the very least, that history has purpose to it, that we're driving towards something. And that in general, good seems to win out over evil. The famous example for this one is, you know, the miracle at Dunkirk, which there was a movie about, which I didn't watch. I don't like historical military movies. I don't know why. I think I know why, but anyway, there was a movie on the miracle at Dunkirk. I have no idea how accurate it was. Like I said, I didn't see it. But essentially what happened here is, again, this is without double checking actual books for these sorts of things. But essentially the entire British army during World War II, or a huge section of it, was trapped on the European mainland at the port at Dunkirk. And the German army was rolling in hot and was looking like they would wipe out most of the British army, as well as most of the British Navy, and essentially a huge concentration of the British military force was at Dunkirk. And they were trying to evacuate, but they couldn't. Or it was going too slowly. And then just this whole, I guess you could call, calamity of errors on the German part, and the forces of history at work all conspired together to get the British troops out. And I think there was like 10 casualties at Dunkirk. It's something crazy, crazy low. Where like the Germans didn't stop to refuel their tanks, and their tanks ran out of gas at one point, so that delayed them enormously. And then a storm rolled in as soon as the ships were off, which kept the Germans from pursuing the British military. It just a whole huge swath of factors came together to get the British army off the mainland of Europe, which allowed Britain to actually be a significant force in World War II, eventually leading to the defeat of Nazi Germany, right? Which I think we can all agree is a good thing, right? That is good, winning out over evil, seemingly even with divine intervention almost, right? There's a reason we call it the miracle at Dunkirk. I think there are problems with this theory. I think a lot of them come out in kind of the way history has been being pushed recently, which I used to really not like, but I'm warming to it, right? There's more social history going on. And there's more in this social history push that's going. People are spending more time on details, like little details Not that this wasn't being done, but there's more emphasis and more focus on little details and on the people who weren't necessarily writing the history books. And the people who were writing the history books maybe whitewashed their history, I think is the kind way of putting it. And the more work we're doing in these social history fields, looking at more of the little guy and the people who weren't the ones writing the books, the people who were having atrocities committed against them. And this isn't like an anti-European or American. People get all tied up about this in the United States. People are sinful. We don't need to be worried that Christopher Columbus was kind of a terrible person, right? That's okay. That doesn't degrade America or the United States right now. That's getting too sensitive about certain things, right? I would rather an accurate understanding of history than some whitewashed, hyper-patriotic understanding. That's just not true, right? Those who don't learn their history are doomed to repeat it, right? A lot of the things that Columbus did that were pretty awful were repeated a lot. And now that those are becoming more popular, at least in the popular understanding, it's not like people know this. But it's more popular to put this stuff out there. We're recognizing that history is pretty rough, guys. A lot of really bad stuff happened ever since Adam and Eve, right? And as Christians, we shouldn't be surprised by this. In fact, this is what we expect history to be. So I see what the historical argument is trying to do. I don't think it's necessarily wrong. I don't know. I'm a historian. Maybe I'm too close to it. But yeah, not a huge fan of the historical argument, personally. So, we've noted as we've gone through, these arguments have a lot of problems. One is that ever since every one of these has been proposed, people have kind of said, no, that's ridiculous, right? Here's a counter argument. And they're good counter arguments. Don't get me wrong. It's not like people are just coming out of the woodwork with their counter arguments to these natural arguments for God. A lot of them are very credible. And some of them have counters to them. Some of them have arguments that can be made against the arguments, right? And that's the fun of philosophy, right? You can go back and forth and you're searching for the truth, right? If you're strictly philosophy, you don't care what the truth is, you just want to find the truth. And so you can go back and forth. But it's important to note that none of these are ringers, right? It's not like if you get into a debate with someone, right, as we all do, about whether or not God exists, you can just pull out your teleological argument card, slap it on the table, and walk away having won the argument. It don't work that way. None of these are that strong. They all have downfalls. Another shortcoming, let's say you buy all of these arguments. They tell us almost nothing about God. You get some, right? God is moral. God likes order. But that doesn't tell us a whole lot about him. Certainly doesn't tell us how we are viewed by God, what our relationship is with God, or if God has any interest in us at all, or even an awareness of us. Maybe the historical argument says something different. But for the most part, these arguments tell us nothing about God. All they can do at their best is just say that God is, that God exists. Although I would say that we've gone over them because it helps us understand that it's reasonable to believe that there's a God, right? That's one of the goals of apologetics, is to say, am I rational for thinking these things? Yes. Here are, 7 reasons why? 6 reasons why. Here are 6 arguments for why, yes, you are reasonable for understanding it. Understand that people disagree. That's okay. You're allowed to disagree. The last shortcoming, especially from a Christian apologetic standpoint, is that every one of these arguments can be argued with equal force for every deity, right? Allah, Zeus, Vishnu, Mother Nature, right? Satan, if you want to be a Satanist, right? They all work. It's not as if these arguments prove or even lean toward the Christian God. So they're helpful to a point. But those are the 6 arguments for God, for the deity. So the next thing I want to cover is something I always give the wrong name of. I always call this next thing Occam's wager, and that's not what it is. So probably shouldn't have started with the wrong one. Right now, you're all going to be confused. But if you ever hear me put my foot in my mouth and start talking about Occam's wager, if you're with me, you can raise your hand and say, no, that's not what that's called. It's Occam's razor, which is another philosophical concept. It's really interesting. Nothing to do with what we're talking about. What I do want to talk about is Pascal's wager. I don't remember Pascal's first name. It's Pascal's wager and Occam's razor. Hopefully you can sympathize with why my brain... I never call it Pascal's razor, though. It's always Occam. I remember thinking to myself, wow, that Occam guy did a lot of stuff, right? He did both the razor and the wager. No, he didn't. It's Pascal's wager. You may have heard of this before. Essentially, it's a way to say it's more reasonable to believe in God than not in God. And the way it's laid out is this. Let's assume that there's equal evidence for there being God and there not being God. And for the sake of time and for this study, let's just say it's the Christian God. So there's equal weight for the Christian God and for there not being any God at all. Okay, so there's no evidential way to go either direction. So what do you as a rational person do? What is the reasonable way to carry on with your life from there? Well, Pascal's wager says, okay, what are the outcomes? What are the 2 various outcomes? So on the one hand, if God, let's assume God is true, or the Christian God is true. Well, then there are 2 branches that come out of that statement. On the one hand, if you believe in the Christian God and the Christian God is true, well, then you get to experience, right, all the joys of paradise, right, all the heaven and all that kind of good stuff. If the Christian God is real and you don't believe in him, well, then you'll spend eternity suffering in hell. So which of those 2 is a better option? Clearly to believe in God is just the better of those 2. All right, so let's keep that in mind. Now let's presume the other to be true. There is no God. All of this is just chance, all that kind of stuff. Well, on the one hand, let's assume that there is no God, but we believe that there is a Christian God. Well, what's the result? When you die, there are no consequences. And when you're living, okay, you have some prohibitions on licentious behavior, but in general, you live a decent life. You live one that seems to, is a morally upright life, hopefully. And you live with comfort about what will happen to you after you die, even if it's not true. Okay, so you do lose some. There's some loss, although it can be balanced out. On the other hand, if there is no God and you don't believe that there's a God, well, there's no consequences and there's really no change to your life at all. All right, so these are the 4 outcomes. But we can split them into 2 camps, right? So there's you believe in Christianity and you don't believe in Christianity. The benefits to believing in Christianity, if God is true, far outweigh not believing if Christianity is true. And it's pretty much a wash on the other side. So it is rational, right? If you're a betting man, you should place your bet on the Christian God. It's essentially how Pascal's wager works. Now, some problems with Pascal's wager. One, the one that comes up, if you look this up, almost instantaneously, is that it really feels academically dishonest, right? You have no reason to believe either one, but just in case you're going to believe in the Christian God, that's fair. Also, from the standpoint of a believer, what kind of life are you really living? You're going to be, if the reason you are there is Pascal's wager, your life is going to be weird. Weird things are going to come out of this. Now, I go over this because hopefully this at least allows a door to be open for someone who's kind of on the fence, doesn't know which way to go. And then once they're in, because it's, well, you're hedging your bets, then the Holy Spirit does its work and you get through to true faith and all that good stuff there. Helpful, but only as far as it goes. So the last thing I want to close with, everything we've done so far has been about natural knowledge of God, natural arguments for God. They've all fallen short. But remember, at the beginning of this, the whole 40-ish minutes ago, I had you remember that this is our second lesson. This is not our first lesson. We started with Christ and the deity of Christ before we move into the existence of God. And here's why. If Jesus rose from the dead, which we've already established he did, and if he's God, then we can trust what he says. First of all, we're tabling the whole he's already God. So we've already established whether God exists or not. But we'll put that off to the side just for the sake of argument. If Jesus rose from the dead, we can trust what he says. It's kind of like oh man, the sports analogy. His name is escaping me. My father's going to be disappointed in me. And he was wanting a shout out. I mentioned my mother on the last video, so here you go, Dad. Baseball player, Jackie Robinson, I think. You guys know who I'm talking about. This is bad. This is embarrassing. It's just not there. Anyway, before I just finish commiserating the fact that I can't remember this, the Babe Ruth. Jackie Robinson. Babe Ruth. It's Babe Ruth. There's a candy bar named after him, which I am not ashamed to say is how I got his name. Babe Ruth, right? That famous scene, right? I've seen it, so it has to be famous, considering how much I struggled just to get Babe Ruth's name out. Right? Walks up to the plate, points, and then calls his shot, right? Hits the home run. Jesus did that. Jesus called his shot. He said, you can believe in me because when I die, I will, not only that, when I am killed, I will rise again 3 days later. And then he did. You can trust him. You can trust his word. And he establishes that there is a God. He establishes that he is God, first of all. And then he also establishes through his teaching, through his ministry, that there's God the Father, right? Which is what most people mean when they just say God, but we're not going to talk about mere monotheism here today. Although very interesting. My confirmation students, if you're watching this, you should know that mere monotheism is the reason why I don't allow God to be a correct answer in my class. You need to give me a person of the Trinity, or to say the Trinity, right? Maybe sometimes that will work, but God is not an acceptable answer. I need a person of the Trinity. But because we can trust what Jesus says, we can trust that there's a God. So if you ask me, why do I believe in God? My answer is going to be because Jesus told me. Because Jesus said so. He said there's a God. He said that, right, he is the Son of the Father. He said he would send his Holy Spirit. He establishes that there is deity, that he is deity, and he's part of the Trinity. And because he called his shot, because he rose from the dead, and because it's reasonable for me to believe what he said when he said he was God, I take him at his word. There are problems with this argument too, right? If you don't believe Jesus rose from the dead, if you don't believe you can trust in Jesus' word, we're at an impasse. I understand that. People are going to get frustrated. And sometimes I get frustrated. There's a level of faith here. But what no one seems to remember is that no matter where you land on this, it's faith. Right? Pascal's wager exists because there is no empirical evidence one way or the other. At least through the scientific method, right? I would say my empirical evidence is the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. And so I can trust what he has to say. But that's not satisfying for everyone. It wasn't satisfying for me the first time I heard it, but I have most certainly come around. Furthermore, this is going to lead us into our next lesson, which I believe is going to be in March. Should be in March. I didn't check the calendar for confirmation. This year's I've been notorious for messing up my confirmation dates. So the next thing we're going to cover is less an apologetic and more a history of the Bible. Where does the Bible come from? Can we trust what the Bible has to say? Spoiler alert, yes, you can. Why can you trust what the Bible has to say? Because Jesus says you can. Right? It doesn't go the other way around, which is interesting. Another one of those things that really stretched my mind first time I heard it. I believe in the Bible because Jesus tells me I can. I don't believe in Jesus because the Bible tells me about him. Seems weird. We'll probably talk about it next time. If not, it's one of these really awesome concepts that we can talk about. And who knows, maybe we'll talk about the three foundational systems of the churches in the world today. If we don't talk about it when we talk about where the Bible actually comes from. But until then, all you who wait on the Lord, raise a glass. Let us drink to Christ's imminent return. Cheers. And of course, Keith, I hope you enjoyed.